We start at Lady Lena's funeral after she just got scorched by a real-life Spyro the Dragon, before the mourners proceed to dump her off a cliff like yesterday's turd.
Bruh.
And look, Otto's back. Unfortunately, just like Matt Smith, the makeup department forgot to regenerate him as well, as he really doesn't look like he's aged 10 years either. Princess Rhaenyra asks her son if he's seen his father, and the camera cuts over to his black family, so clearly the answer is no. Especially since Lord Harwin also just died in a fire. Man, what's with all the incinerating going on in this show? Anyway, Alicent stares daggers at her best friend from childhood, whilst Aegon and Aemon talk about which one will have to bang their bug-obsessed sister if they get married off soon. You know, with all this inter-family marrying going on, one wonders why any of these inbred kids don't ever turn out with two heads and a tail. Or at least looking like Steve Buscemi. Elsewhere, Sir Kristen Stewart warns Alicent that Sir Lionel is staring at her like a right smug gimp after totally killing off his entire family just to woo a bit of forbidden pussy. Well, I mean, we've all done it. Sir Laenor is off having a little whittle in the sea, whilst his dad angrily tells Sir Carl to, quote, retrieve your patron, which must be ye olde language for fancy fella or bloke you're totally having it off with behind everyone's backs. King Viserys pays his respects to his brother Daemon in regards to his once figurative but now literal smouldering wife, and offers an olive branch by inviting him to come back to King's Landing and take a place at court by his side. Daemon states Pentos is his home now, and he don't want to be on no stinking court anyway. Viserys accidentally calls his wife Aemma before he goes off to bed, and she can't believe this doddery old fool just got her confused with that useless bird who couldn't even produce an heir. She's cooked him up 3. Back at Driftmark, Princess Rhaenys and the black dude who's watched too many Matrix sequels talk about how Driftmarks should be passed through Laena's line to daughter Baela, i.e. to true Valyrian blood, given the world and his wife knows that Laenor's kids aren't really his. But Lord Corlys reckons no one remembers blood, only names. Well, except King Viserys, I guess.
Bruh.
Later, Prince Daemon and his niece are walking on a beach, with such a terrible night filter on a day shoot that I had to crank up my monitor's brightness to 11t stupid. Rhaenyra moans about him leaving her to be married off to that gay bloke, whilst he just shrugs and says, that's life, baby. But she ain't taking that shit and snogs his face off, before disrobing and having sex on the beach. Which makes me blush so bad I have to turn my screen all the way back down. Across the beach, Prince Aemon finally works out how to train a dragon and ends up totally stealing him and flying off, on what I'm assuming will be all sorts of magical adventures. Then Daemon's kids wake up Jace and tell him that some little scrote just stole their giant fuck-off dragon right from under their nose. The kids confront Prince Aemon, who comes striding in like a boss man, and tells his little cousin that the dragon Vhagar is now his because she took too long to claim him. Then they all get into the most vicious playground fight this side of Hackney, as even Rhaenyra's bastards start piling on the poor Malfoy kid. And before you could say mischief managed, one twat's got a broken nose and the other's lost a fucking eye. As you can imagine, King Viserys is not best pleased. He demands answers, and apparently, Sir Harold saying it's all fun and games till somebody loses an eye doesn't really satisfy the King of Westeros, nor does he find it particularly amusing. Sir Kristen also comes up with his own lame excuse, pleading that he didn't really expect a bunch of kids who are all close family to go around putting out shanks on each other like some butch prison bitch. The Maester confirms the eye is lost, and before long, Lord Corlys comes downstairs, mightily pissed that they have the gall to interrupt his Matrix Reloaded rewatch yet again. When they ask what had happened, all the kids start shouting over each other and slinging insults, whilst Daemon's out here busting out the popcorn. King Viserys puts his gammy foot down and demands silence. He commands his son Aemon to tell the truth of what happened, as Alicent and Rhaenyra start bickering about who's really at fault, before it comes out that the Caucasian kids who look suspiciously like Sir Harwin doppelgangers might not quite be Laenor's legitimate sons. Rhaenyra reckons that calling her Sprogs bastards is the highest of treasons, given they're next in line for the throne, and Prince Daemon can't keep his woody in his trousers, nor the giant smug grin off his face as all this EastEnders drama goes down all around him. They ask where the father is to stand up for his family's dignity and reputation, but no one knows and just assume he's out entertaining his squires, which must be ye olde talk for dogging in a lay-by on the A40. When Viserys presses Aemon for an answer as to who's been spreading hurty rumours, he pawns the buck off to his brother Aegon in order to protect his mum Alicent. And when Viserys then asks him to reveal how he knows about this stuff, The eggy prince calmly states that for fuck's sake, everyone knows, as it's plain as day to anyone with eyes, and the worst kept secret since Princess Diana totally didn't have an affair with her ginger riding coach and Prince Harry is defo Prince Charles's son. Aegon says just look at them if you don't believe me, and King Viserys gawps at his humiliated daughter and her blatantly Caucasian kids, as he just begs for all the interminable infighting to cease, because he's old and grey and just wants to frickin' die in peace already. And by now, Prince Daemon's practically grooming his keks. The king wants them all to kiss and make up, but Alicent ain't having none of that, and literally wants an eye for an eye. He tells her to get a fucking grip and stop being a literal drama queen, before she sticks two fingers up at him and demands Sir Criston go pluck out that kid's eyeball. Poor Criston is caught between a rock and a hard place, and also a king and a queen. But he's totally up for it because he's sworn an oath to her, and also he's still bitter about his ex choosing both a gay bloke and a curly-haired tosser over him. King Viserys orders an end to the madness and hilariously thinks that's that, until Alicent goes completely batshit and tries to stab up her own ex-best friendy's stepdaughter. Daemon tucks in his raging lob on just quick enough to stop Sir Criston from getting to Alicent, and before the queen and her ex-bestie can cut each other to pieces. Otto half-heartedly tells her to put the blade down, whilst King Viserys' orders to stop doing all these bad things fall flatter than Prince Elrond's face. Alicent moans about having sacrificed so much, yet Rhaenyra gets everything on a plate, whilst Rhaenyra calls out her own self-righteousness as the queen slices her wrist. A little later, Otto visits his daughter and tells her he never knew she had it in her to be a right mad lad, and to keep doing what you're doing and you'll totally go far, lass. Elsewhere, Rhaenyra is getting her arm stitched up as, hilariously, Laenor arrives after being out doing God knows what, to find his wife having almost lost an arm and his fake son's nose looking more crooked than Nancy Pelosi's stock trades. Laenor finally comes to his senses and repledges his commitment to his fakey wife bird, what he has no sexual attraction to or romantic connection with. She says she wanted to bear his kids during the few times they shagged, but he just couldn't finish unless it was up her backside, which of course ain't optimal conditions for conceiving a sprog, because I don't think an anal cavity can really act as a sufficient womb, no matter how hard you wish it to. Alicent apologises to King Viserys in the undercarriage, but the exhausted old bugger just wants to sleep, and probably die already. Daemon and Rhaenyra talk about the sea being a better ally than fire, and also being an escape. And as we know from the culty Seaguard fellas from the Rings of Power, the sea is always right! Meanwhile, Lord Larys the Walking Creep is chatting up Alicent, and offers to bring her an actual eye, whilst coming with all the energy of a pervy freak who's desperately waiting for an ankle flash so he can update her WikiFeet page. He reminds her that he's on standby should she ever need any dodgy dealings done. Whilst back across the sea, Princess Rhaenyra and Daemon hatch a plan to bump off her useless homosexual hubby just moments after the poor sap redevoted himself to her, all so she can go off and marry her uncle. She reckons it's just so they can bind their blood so that her claim to the throne will be much tougher to challenge. But really, she just wants a proper marriage where she can get some satisfying dick for her remaining days. So Prince Daemon pays off Laenor's bum chum to totally arkanside his lover in front of witnesses. And afterwards, he can escape via the sea to go to lands where it totally doesn't matter which pipe you take it up. Sir Carl duels Laenor before his parents walk in to find his body being crispy fried in their own fireplace, and realise they've now lost 2 kids in a fiery demise in the span of 2 episodes. Parents of the year, eh? And we end on Rhaenyra and Daemon biting blood as she states via narration that people will totally fear them now that they've seen what they're capable of. Before we linger on a final shot of a baldy Sir Laenor who has faked his death and is now rowing in a boat over to the land of the gays and a real homosexual haven, aka Brighton, England. And that's it. That's episode 7. Man, you've got to feel sorry for Rhaenyra's kids, who have now lost 2 dads in the span of 2 episodes. Which don't bode well for Matt Smith next week if he's going to start popping sprogs with her too. Well, let's find out, shall we? Onward to episode 8. We start with yet another time jump, this time to the tune of 6 years. Apparently, Lord Corlys was too busy watching Matrix Reloaded again to notice he was walking his men into a straight-up ambush, and now he's in critical condition off-screen with a slashed neck and a fever. So now Princess Rhaenys, aka the Queen What Never Was, argues with her brother-in-law Vaemond about who gets to sit on this budget throne made of cheap wood what looks like it will give you splinters in all the wrong places. Or maybe all the right ones. Anyway! Then we cut to a black figure positioning himself into a crack. And no, this ain't that homosexual fella from the last epi back from being fake dead already. Turns out it's Prince Daemon going all Spyro 3 again, and taking yet another egg out from under the sleeping snouts of the dragons. He's then given a note from his daughter Baela updating him about Vaemond wanting that throne thing. Meanwhile, a totally preggers Princess Rhaenyra, yes again, checks in on her son Jace, who has also regenerated, only this time vertically, and doing his GCSEs in foreign languages. Turns out he can't speak High Valyrian to save his life, although he really wants to in order to honour his forebears. Rhaenyra jokes that he'll have plenty of time, well unless he's planning to depose his own mother, whilst he simply gives a look of don't fucking tempt me. Daemon then shows her the letter re Vaemond intending to out their sprogs as literal bastards, and thus delegitimise her claim to the throne. So they decide to go back to King's Landing to prepare to argue their case for Luke Valerian as the Lord of the Tides, and all the inevitable upcoming drama. Elsewhere, some doddery old fella at the end of the table waffles on about Festival of Mums whilst mispronouncing stepstones because Alzheimer's, and we find Alicent is sitting in for the king during court and says she will hear the petition what Rhaenyra and Vaemond want to give about who has the right to sit on that spiky splintered throne thing out in the middle of nowhere. Later, said princess and her new hubby Daemon walk into a smoking crypt-like place and disturb the slumbering ancient vampire Nosferatu. Whoops, I meant King Viserys, who has totally degenerated into some sort of living skeleton type fella. The geezer can barely sit up nowadays, but they introduce their new kids to him anyway. And because they totally lack imagination, they've named the older one Aegon again, and the younger one Viserys Jr., before telling the exhausted old man on the brink of death that the old war in the Stepstones is heating up again, whilst there's also some huge argument going on about who's going to be the heir to the Driftwood throne. Poor Viserys just wants to fucking die already, bless him. Up in the Queen's chamber, a snivelling little girl who says her name is Chelsea Clinton, Diana, is shaking hysterically in floods of tears. It's implied that she's been interfered with, and because Alicent is a progressive queen, she believes all women, even without evidence, because sod all that innocent until proven guilty shit, and reckons her son's a right git. But regardless, she tries to get this maid with clear PTSD to shut up about it because it's actually quite embarrassing, bro, and soon hands her a bag of coins to forget all about the unfortunate raping theme, and makes her down a cup of abortion juice right there in front of her. Soon after, Alicent storms into the Eggy Prince's room and says that forcing himself on the maids ain't fucking on, son. Especially because that abortion juice costs a friggin' fortune, and they're going through more of the stuff than a millennial TikToker. Aegon can't barely remember the previous night's events, but says it's cool because it was just a bit of fun. You know, this is what happens when you let your son get away with wanking into the sky all day. Shocked and disgusted, she totally disinherits him, if only symbolically, and he whines about trying so hard but it never being enough to impress his mum and dad. Well, I'm sure diddling the local maids will certainly make him all proud. Alicent then meets with Rhaenyra and Daemon, with an atmosphere so thick I thought I was on fucking Venus for a minute. They make veiled barbs at her apparently thinking she's the big cheese by being chair of the court and stuff, but she maintains she's just a steward of the king whilst he stays in bed all day dying of scabs. The princess implies they are keeping him drugged, so he has to stay in bed, just so they can cosplay as rulers of the realm. And Alicent don't like the inference of treason and reckons without it, he'd be well suffering. Daemon then asks why then, if it's just about mercy, have they removed Targaryen heraldry and installed a load of new age stars and shit? She says it's just to remind them all of a higher authority, and Rhaenyra scoffs and asks how she can possibly be impartial when tomorrow she will sit and make the judgment about who's going to be the heir of Skidmark when she hates the guts of her ex-best friend turned stepdaughter foe, and which is clearly a giant conflict of interest. Anyway, Jace and Lucerys are in the courtyard, but Luke is worried that everyone's staring at them because Sir Harwin's bastard boys are totally closer to a Milky Bar than they are caramel chocolate, and peeps are beginning to question his inheritance of Driftmark. Over their shoulder, two blokes are fighting, and the pussification of Sir Criston is now complete, as he can't even win a practice fight against a one-eyed blonde boy who's recently regenerated into a Lucius Malfoy-looking psycho. Later, Queen Alicent, Otto and Vaemond are scheming about what to do when the king finally croaks, as shit in the Stepstones is getting hot, and if things properly kick off, it'll be at a time when a kid is on the throne, if Lucerys is confirmed as heir of Skidmark, that is. Out in the gardens, Princesses Rhaenyra, Rhaena and Rhaenys, fuck me, seriously? Are having a bit of bonding time. Before I remember that Rhaenyra totally had Rhaenys' son burned to a crisp last epi, so naturally she's still fuming about it even 6 years later. Bruh. Her stepdaughter swears that she weren't involved in the death of her homosexual partner, what had no romantic interest in her, which I suppose is kinda true since he faked his death and shit, and Rhaenyra tries to work out if her ex-stepmum is there to back her up, or instead advocate for herself to be deep-throned. given deep down she's still hung up on being robbed of it years ago just because she has a nunny. Rhaenyra concludes it's a massive trap, and so desperately offers to marry her son Luke and Laena's children together so that Baela will be queen, and thus Rhaena will rule in Driftmark and the seat will pass to her and Luke's kids in time. Anyway, Rhaenys says she stinks of desperation, but leaves to think it over. Elsewhere, Nosferatu seems to be spending all day in bed like a moody teenager who don't want to go to school. And Princess Rhaenyra moans that by naming her as his heir 15 odd years ago, he totally divided the realm. But if he truly wants her to bear the burden, then he needs to get off his lazy arse and straight up defend her. The next morning, the king is awake and getting his scab seen to, whilst making more strange noises than my stomach on Taco Bell night. Anyway, he wants his family to dine together for a change, so he can get them all around a table and say, stop with all the hurty words and get back to shagging each other. Or something like that. Later, the court proceedings are in session, with Otto swaggering on the throne standing in for the king, and Vaemond is first up to put his case for the succession. Vaemond reckons whoever sits on the chair has to at least have the pure blood of a true Valyrian. Rhaenyra is triggered, and retorts that her pasty white kid sons are pure blood, and that he's just all about his own ambition. Otto then calls the princess to properly state her case, but before you can say, this is going to end well, that bloody Nosferatu fella bursts in without even needing an invitation. King Viserys has clearly been watching too much Phantom of the Opera reruns whilst lying in bed all day doing fuck all and dying of scabs, and takes 5 full-on minutes to walk down the hall, before almost passing out before his arch-enemy, the stairs. Unfortunately, due to budget cuts, they can't even afford a basic chairlift, and after refusing to be assisted by his guard, he tries to ascend them himself, before almost passing out again as the crown slides off his noggin. In a workplace incident more humiliating than that time Jeffrey Toobin got caught yanking it in a Zoom meeting. Anyway, it gets so painfully cringe that eventually Daemon has to step in and slumps him down on that fucking death trap chair, complete with more pointy daggers than a Riley Reid gangbang. What? Anyway, once seated, the king can't understand why this is still all going on after he totally settled the succession when he named his Sprog and Oline as heirs to the kingdom all those years ago. So he asks his cousin Rhaenys to step forward and provide some clarification. And after a tense build-up as to who she's going to side with, turns out she totally stabs Vaemond in the back and agrees to Rhaenyra's earlier offer, i.e. to marry her kids Jace and Luke to Lord Corlys's granddaughters, Baela and Rhaena. The king then happily confirms Prince Lucerys as heir to Skidmark, but Vaemond is outraged, knowing that the heir to his own ancient kingdom is going to be effectively stolen by some scrawny soy boy what ain't nothing to do with him. At his last ebb, now that the officially sanctioned gaslighting has taken everything from him, he boldly proclaims that his fake nephew Lucerys is indeed a fake and certainly no true Valyrian. Daemon eggs him on to say the key word, and with nothing more to lose, he totally does. And after calling the princess a whore and the king's grandson a literal bastard to his fucking face, Viserys weakly rises and pulls out a shank, demanding his tongue. But before you can say, who you frigging fooling, old man, Daemon slices Vaemond's skull in two like a juicy fleshy watermelon. The king collapses in weary exhaustion and says he really needs to have that family meal so he can put all this beef into bed with a nice piece of actual beef. At said meal, the whole family are gathered for what's inevitably going to be the most strained family dinner since Prince Harry and Meghan had to mingle with Prince Wills and Kate by the buffet table at the Queen's wake. Anyway, because they haven't invented wheels yet in this medieval alt-universe, poor guardsmen have to haul the king to the table like he's a common hog. He then toasts the newly agreed ancestral union of his grandkids, whilst Aegon taunts his cousin about being a virgin incel fella, and he tells him that if he needs to know how the act is done, then come to him, because he's well versed in this shagging stuff, given all the maid molesting he gets up to. Bruh. Viserys hauls himself up to make a unifying speech, and proceeds to put everyone off their dinner by taking off his mask and showing everyone the giant gaping hole in his revolting infected face, and giving new meaning to the classic British phrase, "Oh my, scabby eye meat pie." After his speech telling them all to be nice because they're totally family, Rhaenyra becomes the bigger person. Quite literally, because she stands up. And apologises to Alicent for all the aggro over the years. Alicent then gets up herself and says, yeah, ditto mate. After that lovely moment of truth and reconciliation, Aegon can't stop himself from taunting his cousin yet again by telling his future wife sitting directly beside him that she's totally going to be disappointed by his manhood. And if she wants some proper cock, then she can totally come to him. Jace then shoots up and ignores Noel Gallagher's advice from back in the 90s when he literally looks back in anger, before trying to rise above the taunting by making a speech, where he says he hopes they can all be friends and allies now they're supposedly grown men. The king is totally proud of Jace and tells the DJ to play some banging tunes, and Jace takes his revenge by asking Aegon's wife to dance, before proceeding to jump around on the dance floor like some awkward year 8 to their first proper disco. Anyway, the king is so old that he almost passes out just watching people chewing, And after retiring to bed, shit hits the fan again when some joker pranks Eamon by putting a roasted pig in front of his face. In a callback to that time in episode 6 when he was bullied for not being any good with taming dragons and they gave him a fake pig with wings to practice on. So he slams his fist on the table and makes a speech himself, where he calls Rhaenyra's bastard kids handsome, wise and strong. Bruh. He then mentions the word strong multiple times with pointed effect, given their real father was Sir Harwin Strong. And hilariously, the strong boys proceed to get triggered by compliments. Just like AOC when you tell her that she's your favourite big booty Latina. Later, they all go to bed, as in the bowels of the castle, that foreigny bird, who I have to rely on HBO subtitles to even understand when she's apparently just talking in plain English, totally returns. It seems like Daemon's ex-squeeze has a spy in the castle who totally tells her about all the drama and shenanigans going on up there. Meanwhile, Alicent puts King Viserys to bed, whilst he exhaustedly rambles about that prophecy he once told her about back at the start of the series. But he's so tired he does a Joe Biden and speaks in big gaps and half sentences so no fucker can understand him, and says something about the old Prince Aegon and his dreams of songs of ice and fire, and how he was what was promised to unite the realm, or something. Unfortunately, Alicent takes that to mean he's advising her to place her son Aegon on the throne, and bemused she just shrugs and says, well, if you say so, and goes off to stir up some more shit, whilst the exhausted king finally seems to croak. Although at this point it could just yet be another phony fake out. I wouldn't be surprised if this fella crawled out from under a dumpster at the start of their next epi. And that's it, that's episode 8. Man, Paddy Considine with half a face does better acting than most of the Rings of Power cast with a bunch of full faces between them. Although, being Botoxed up the kazoo don't half help. And I love how this show combines such incredible drama just from some doddery old geezer walking up to a throne for 5 minutes straight. Anyway, on to episode 9. We start with a lost preteen roaming about in the dark, and before the ghost of Jeffrey Epstein can swoop in and take him off to some island, Alicent is informed by a maid that her scabby old hubby is finally croaked. So she goes to see her dad and tells him that the king's final wish was for her oldest kid Aegon to be king, after she unknowingly misinterpreted the garbled words of a fading old crone who was in the final throes of perishing brain cells. The small council is convened, and Otto explains what Alicent just told him about Viserys wanting that blonde boy to be king. You know, the prince he never really liked because he was always wanking into the skies and horny teen and kept spunking on his crown as he went out for a smoke. Liberties! Anyway, this Tywin Lannister fella, and no, this isn't that Jason Lannister bloke from episodes 3 and 5, despite being played by the same actor because reasons, reckons that now they can proceed with their long-laid plans, as a baffled Alicent is shocked that they've all been planning this massive coup behind the king's back for years and are now ready to go barely 40 minutes after the king's last breath. Otto moves straight to preparing to put the Eggy Prince on the throne, and to round up Rhaenyra and Daemon so they can't be party poopers and say, hey, hang about, that was supposed to be my chair, son. Speaking of party poopers, that doddery old guy with Alzheimer's from last week says exactly that, and reckons that putting that horny kid on the throne just because his mum says she heard the king totally say he wanted it despite having no corroborating witnesses to confirm it, is a stretch too far. And actual treason aside, it'll totally start a war and get thousands of people killed, including themselves. He then says he's 67 years old, and his old mate Viserys never once talked about sticking that sticky spunker on the throne. And the doddery old fool, who has nothing to lose due to old age, straight up accuses a lot of them of regicide. Which, incidentally, is what I got accused of after that time I accidentally knocked my mate Reg in the lake before he had time to blow up his armbands properly. Sir Kristen Stewart then channels a Colombian care home nurse and beats up a frail old geezer when he starts to cause a ruckus. And because he doesn't know his own strength, he ends up killing the guy with one shove. Yes, just like me with my mate Reg. Suddenly, Sir Kristen gets all hot under the collar and whips out his sword. Steady! Because a meeting without this Prince of Persia fella trying to kill a bloke just isn't worth having. And Commander of the Knights Guard Sir Harold draws his own weighty blade and demands he lay down his arms. Fuck me! The king's only been gone an hour, and already a pensioner's dead, and the night guards are fighting each other like a bunch of Kardashians. Otto tells them to calm down, before the council continue planning their straight-up coup. Alicent tells them that this course of action will lead to all-out war, because Daemon and Rhaenyra will never bow like utter cucks. Otto thinks she makes a good point, and so tells Sir Harold to go slice them up like a common hog before they try and fight back and shit. Sir Harold then literally throws in the towel, after being ordered to go slaughter his dead mate's kids. Alicent herself is shocked at the ruthlessness of her dad, and although wants to keep doing the secret treason thing, deep down doesn't really want her ex-best friend turned stepdaughter foe to be killed or harmed, especially given they just slightly made up at the end of the last epi. Shortly after, Otto and Alicent go to find Prince Egan, but find only his wife staring at a clock, because remember, this is set in the days before the internet and there's fuck all else to do. Anyway, Otto then secretly asks Sir Eric where the prince actually is, and the prince's sworn protector tells him that he has no idea where he's got to, despite it literally being his one fucking job to watch over him at all costs.
Bruh.
He reckons the prince regularly exploits his authority to tell him to sod off and leave him alone, making me wonder why any of the prince and princesses ever let these randos follow them about all the time when safe at home and in their own castle to totally cramp their style. Oh, that's right, because if they don't, they end up shanking their own cousins and gouging out their eyes. Yeah, so maybe this Sir Eric geezer should probably be fired for just letting him get told to get fucked. After last time they did that, a dragon got stolen and a twat lost an eye. Anyway, Princess Rhaenys then finds herself locked in her room, as Sir Criston tells Alicent about Sir Eric going out to find her son. So she sends Kristen Stewart and her one-eyed psycho son to retrieve him first, like a human version of a narrative MacGuffin. Unfortunately, Prince of Persia and Lucius Malfoy are pretty iconic cultural characters and instantly recognisable, and so they disguise themselves by wearing a small hat and pulling up their hood, as if people won't instantly recognise a lanky geezer with a giant scar and eye patch. Turns out the local whorehouse ain't seen the eggy prince fella, though the madam of the brothel does compliment Prince Aemond on how he's grown. Saucy! Meanwhile, Otto declares that the king totally changed his mind only milliseconds before meeting the Grim Reaper, and so all the heads of house must suitably amend their backing. Two virtuous saps say they swore an oath to recognise Princess Rhaenyra as heir back in episode 1, and their word must always mean something and thus cannot be broken. They then get taken off to get deaded, so naturally all the others bend the knee harder than Colin Kaepernick at a footy match. Hilariously, turns out Sir Eric has a twin brother called Sir Eric. And in their search for the eggy prince fella, soon explore the seedy underbelly of kindergarten fighting rings, in which 10-year-olds are smacking each other up because the owners make them steal each other's Barbies and Action Man dolls, or some shit. Elsewhere, the baldy cuck who bent the knee a few minutes ago tries to make a dash for it, whilst Prince Aemond tells Sir Criston that he should totally be the new king, given he's studied history, languages, and rather aptly looks like a right psychopath, so he'd be perfect for the role. Back with Tweedledee and Tweedledonut, they're approached by a woman who tries to broker a deal between her master and Otto in relation to the location of the eggy prince. The baldy cuck gets questioned back at the castle, and then gets himself taken off to be deaded because they reckon he was about to go and warn Rhaenyra and Daemon about their impending doom and shit. Snitches get stitches, bro. And a fucking noose to boot. Later, the handmaids go about mummifying that Viserys fella what recently started cosplaying as the ancient vampire Nosferatu, before Princess Rhaenys demands answers from Alicent about why she's been locked in her room for the whole day like a toddler what called their mum a slag, or something like that. The king is finally dead, she's told, before Rhaenys works out that the queen's totally eyeing the throne, which is bad news for Rhaenys given she backed up Rhaenyra's claim in the last epi and the king specifically stated her fake kids should be rulers of both King's Landing and Skidmark. Alicent reckons that allying with Rhaenyra has got her nowhere but locked up in a castle and with a pair of dead kids, who all seem to end up burnt to a crisp for some reason. Alicent says there's no stopping this now, but they can totally guide the men on the throne away from blood and slaughter. Rhaenys says the word of her house still means something, and her mind seems to be made up. She's totally Team Rhaenyra, even though that bitch clearly got a son murdered and then married her daughter's widow. Then Matt Smith's ex Floozy, who's nicknamed herself as a White Worm for some reason, tells Otto that she'll hand over the eggy prince if he promises to totally shut down those kiddie rings where they smack each other up over Pokemon cards, or something. He concedes by giving her the most threatening verbal agreement since my landlord said I can stay in his attic rent-free if I totally say nothing about his sleeping mum in the closet and don't mind strong smells. Anyway, Tweedledee and Tweedledum and Dumber then retrieve the eggy prince who's hiding under a giant fuck-off table because reasons, whilst also literally calling for his mummy. But before they can take him back to the hand, Sir Criston Stewart turns up, saying he totally wants a piece of that eggy prince fella what wanks into the sky and all. So they proceed to smack swords, whilst Prince Aemon Malfoy rugby tackles his eggy bro, who says he don't want the stinking throne anyway. Back at the castle, Alicent calls Otto out on all his schemes and game playing, but he totally changes the subject and says she looks just like her mum in certain lights. Naturally, she storms out in disgust at essentially being told she looks like a fucking corpse. Up in her chambers, Queen Alicent meets with Larys Strong, who basically implies that he told her dad Otto where to find her son Aegon and thus expects some kind of reward. She sighs while slipping off her shoes and sitting down opposite him. And after making what I thought at the time was a random joke about him having the energy of a foot fetish freak in the last epi, it turns out I was totally psychic, because it seems the price for his help and info is straight up foot pics. And she proceeds to show him her stinky feet as payment. And he can't hide his raging lob on after she takes off her socks to prize more deets out of this foot freak creep. And before you can say, I didn't know Tarantino directed this epi, we cut to her degraded face as he's straight up jerking it in the background. In the early hours of the morning, Princess Rhaenys is smuggled out of the castle by a loyal knight, before hilariously getting cornered in a small square by a clusterfuck of plebs, guards and random sheep.
Bruh.
After mopping up the crusty spunk off her feet, Queen Alicent then tells her eggy prince fella to cheer the frig up, because he's totally going to be king within the hour, even though she totally disinherited him in the last epi because of all the maid molesting, and clearly thinks nothing of putting an actual rapist on the most powerful throne in the kingdom. Meanwhile, Princess Rhaenys gets caught up in the crowd who have been ushered into the abbey for the coronation ceremony, which seems to have a longer queue than the line to see Queen Liz did last month, though presumably doesn't have a medieval equivalent of this morning presenters jumping the queue there too.
LOL.
Otto announces the death of the king, and that the elderly Viserys bloke what could barely speak in the last days of his life totally and clearly told his queen that the eggy prince what wanked into the sky and fondles maids should totally be king because reasons. Bizarrely, they all cheer and accept it without question, just like most of the British public do when anything appears on the BBC IRL. Then a bunch of Ponzi soldiers burst in doing silly walks, whilst Rhaenys disappears underneath the abbey to the Dragon's Keep. Anyway, despite his trepidation and ungratefulness about this whole head of the monarchy malarkey, Aegon starts to appreciate the appeal once the people totally cheer his ascension. Suddenly though, a giant fuck-off dragon appears and straight up murders a bunch of innocent people what don't deserve it, before proceeding to not murder a bunch of totally wicked people what totally do deserve it because reasons. Hilariously, newly crowned King Aegon cowers behind his mother like a riot cack, whilst Princess Rhaenys engages in a staring contest with the Queen and then leaves. And that's it. That's the plot and that's your lot. Man, I was just starting to like that Rhaenys bird and feel sorry for her having lost all her family and kids, until she straight up murdered more poor background artists than producers did in the Rings of Power episode 6. And what on earth was she thinking? Why leave alive your worst enemy so you know will totally come after you when you totally had them by the balls? I dunno. Maybe it'll be answered in the last epi. Anyway, consider ringing that bell thing so you don't miss the finale recap when it drops. Say hello in the comments if you have time, and I'll see you in the next one.